The following presentation covers the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It's May 1787. Arthur St. Clair is the President of Congress. Congress is meeting in New York City at this time. The United States has been free of British rule for 4 years, and the government operates under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation gives most of the powers to the states. The national government did not have power to tax. It could only request funds from the states. The continental, the American currency, is essentially worthless in 1787. There is no standardization regarding interstate trade, making trade over state lines complicated and confusing. Shays' recent rebellion earlier in 1787, a revolt of debt-clad farmers in western Massachusetts, many of whom were veterans of the Revolution, forced many prominent founding fathers, including George Washington, to realize that the Articles of Confederation needed revision. Thus, a new convention is called to amend the infant government. Delegates are once again meeting in Philadelphia in May 1787. 11 years previously, in 1776, the Continental Congress had met in the State House in Philadelphia to declare independence from Britain. Now, some of the same men are meeting in the same building to reform the new United States government. The State House came to also be called Independence Hall. In May, before a quorum had arrived, James Madison is already campaigning with his fellow Virginia delegates. Madison sees that there is support among the delegates for a major change to the national government instead of just a few amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Thus, a Virginia plan, as it came to be known, already had a framework for a new government before the convention officially started. The proposed national government would have 3 branches: executive, judicial, and legislative. The legislative, or congressional, representation would be based on population, not on equality between the states, as existed in the Articles of Confederation. On May 25th, in Philadelphia, at the State House, the Constitutional Convention now has a quorum. The convention is in session. George Washington is voted president of the convention. There are some notable absences at this convention. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams are in Europe at this time. Patrick Henry, the early firebrand for independence and the proponent of individual liberty, declined to attend, thinking the convention was too secretive. May 29. The delegates agree to keep the deliberations secret. Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia addresses the convention, calling for major reform to the national government. Randolph officially proposes the Virginia Plan, the previously described brainchild of James Madison, with 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, and outlined for a new government. The Virginia Plan states that the national legislature, Congress, will have 2 houses, with each state represented by its population. Thus, large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania would have more members in both houses than small states like Rhode Island and Delaware. Proportional representation by population in the Virginia Plan is fundamentally different than the Articles of Confederation, which grants that states have equal representation in Congress. In this Virginia Plan, we see the fruit of Madison's long study of republics. A primary feature of the new government is checks and balances. The body that makes the laws, the legislative branch, is different from the body that interprets the law, the judicial branch, which in turn is different from the body that executes the law, the executive branch. The separation of powers into 3 branches would protect the national system from fashionable changes, as not one faction would be able to control all parts of the system at the same time. The next day, May 30th, there is agreement that the new government should have 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. However, the first major sticking point has emerged. Should the states be represented in Congress equally or proportionally by population? Thus, Madison's plan, the Virginia Plan, becomes the center of conversation. Delegates from small states like Delaware oppose proportional representation in Congress, fearing that their sovereignty is under threat. The small states respond. June 15, 1787, William Paterson of New Jersey introduces the New Jersey Plan. Paterson argues that each state in the legislature, Congress, would retain an equal vote in Congress. So the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan are offering different versions of the legislative branch. The New Jersey plan would be more like the Articles of Confederation, with the states maintaining strong sovereignty over Congress, while the Virginia plan calls for a powerful national government where the larger states have more say in Congress. The New Jersey plan gives Congress new powers, but Congress cannot act without the consent of the states, granting the states powerful autonomy in the national government. Deliberations begin between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. June 18th, Alexander Hamilton takes the floor. He opposes both plans, but especially the New Jersey plan, as it grants too much sovereignty to the states. Hamilton is insistent that no state laws can be contrary to the national government, nor can the states have militias independent of national control. Hamilton desires a strong executive, and he freely uses the word monarch to describe this executive, who would govern for life. The next day, June 19th, Madison argues that the New Jersey plan solves none of the national issues existing with the current government. June 25th, the convention agrees that the second branch of national legislation, later called the Senate, would be selected by state legislatures. Debate, however, continues on whether state representation in the legislative branch would be proportional or equal. June 29, Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut offers a solution to the representation debate. The first branch of Congress, later called the House of Representatives, would be proportional by population. The second branch of Congress, later called the Senate, would have equal representation by the states. Ellsworth is offering a compromise within Madison's plan. Ellsworth concedes that one house should be proportional to account for population, yet the sovereignty of the small states could yet be preserved in the other house, with all states having equal say there, as argued by the New Jersey plan. Proportional representation is agreed for the first branch, the House of Representatives. Intense debate continues over representation in the second branch, the Senate. July 3, 1787. Roger Sherman of Connecticut advances Ellsworth Compromise Plan, where the first branch of Congress will be based on representation and the second branch will have equal representation between the states. The next day is the 4th of July, the 11th anniversary of independence, an independence that was resolved and signed in this same State House building. The next day, July 5th, returns to heated debates over representation in Congress. July 6th, the debate over representation becomes even more bitter, with South Carolina delegates stating that slaves and property should be included in state representation. Ironically, if the southern states triumph in this argument, slave states would gain more representation in Congress by counting their slaves who had no rights. On the other end of the spectrum, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island have already adopted legislation toward emancipation. A North-South division over slavery enters the debate over representation. By July 10th, the representation debate enters a new phase. Before it had been between large states and small states. Now, the divide is between North and South over slave representation. In an eerie presage of the future, it is the delegates from South Carolina that demand slave tabulation and representation. The next day, July 11th, delegates float the idea of counting slaves as 3/5 of a person as a compromise between North and South. And on the next day, July 12th, a compromise is reached. Slaves will count as 3/5 of a person in congressional representation, and a census will be conducted every 10 years to recalibrate representation. While the convention is debating a new government in Philadelphia, Congress is in session in New York City. On July 13th in New York City, Congress passes the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance outlined the way in which the Great Lakes region, future Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, would develop into territories and then into states. Slavery is forbidden in these Northwest territories, freedom of religion is granted, and public education is encouraged. July 16. Back in Philadelphia, the long, bitter debate over congressional representation comes to a close. It's a compromise. The first branch of national legislation, which would be the House of Representatives, would be based on proportional representation. A census would be conducted every 10 years to recalibrate state representation. And finally, narrowly, it was agreed that the second branch of national legislation, the future Senate, would have equal representation among the states. With congressional representation solved, the delegates can now turn to other issues. By July 23rd, New Hampshire delegates have arrived at the convention. 12 states are now represented at the convention, with only Rhode Island absent. The delegates have worked out enough details that a constitution is set to be drafted. It is agreed that state conventions would need to ratify the Constitution. A new sticking point at this time is how the executive, who will be called president, will be elected. On July 24th, it is agreed for now that the national legislature would elect the president. However, some delegates are floating the idea of a popular election for the president. July 26th. By this point, many provisions have been resolved by the convention. The national government will have legislative, judicial, and executive branches. The legislature will have two houses. One house's representation will be determined by population, and the other house will have equal representation between the states. A census will occur to determine the representation of the states in Congress. While the legislative branch will make the laws, the executive will have the power to veto those laws. In addition, a supreme tribunal of judges will oversee cases under the laws passed by the national legislature. So, the people who pass judgment on the laws are different than the people who make the law. Each state is guaranteed a republican form of government. Each state shall be protected from violence, both foreign and domestic. A first draft of the Constitution is now being prepared. August 6, 1787. The first draft of the Constitution is furnished to the convention. We, the people, is in ink. Debate on the details continues. August 8th. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania is adamantly opposed to the southern states gaining representation in Congress due to slavery. Morris states, "Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote." Morris contends that it is blatant hypocrisy to develop a republic in which slave states gain congressional representation through human bondage. August 17. The delegates debate the executive's war powers. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts expressed that he never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war. However, Madison argues that the executive may need to act quickly to repel a sudden attack. August 20th. The convention approves the expansion of legislative power, approving the phrase, "to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers." On August 22nd, the delegates again clash over slavery, specifically if the Atlantic slave trade should be banned or taxed. On the next day, August 23rd, the delegates pass a clause that would make the Constitution the supreme law of the land. Through the latter days of August, the delegates go line by line through the draft Constitution. August 31st. With the Constitution nearly ready, the delegates decide that 9 out of the 13 states will need to ratify the document for the new government to take effect. On September 1st, 1787, a committee is developed to resolve the remaining issues with the draft Constitution. There is an important issue left for this committee. How will the executive, the president, be elected? Originally, the delegates had thought the legislature, Congress, would select the president. However, this appeared to breach the check system between the executive and the legislature, as the president might then be subordinate to Congress. On September 4th, the committee devises an electoral college with the number of electors in each state proportional to state population. These electors would act on behalf of the state and vote for the president. September 12th. A new draft of the Constitution is ready. September 15th. Edmund Randolph, George Mason, and Elbridge Gerry state their reservations about the Constitution. Randolph and Gerry believe the legislature, Congress, had too much power, and Mason fears power is now too centralized. Nevertheless, the state delegations agreed to the document. On September 17, 39 delegates signed the Constitution, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry refusing to sign. The Constitutional Convention has succeeded in creating a written document for a new government. Now, the document will go to Congress in New York City and then on to the states for ratification. 9 of the 13 states will need to assent to the document for the new government to be established. This new revolution, carried out in taverns and newspapers, will be with words, not muskets.